Welcome to the Gnostic Informant. I'm Jesus, the Logos incarnate, and you are about to attain true Gnosis.
And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. Today I'm joined by Dr. Tony Burke, and if he has a website, it's in the links in the description, and just click, it's tonyburke.ca, and there's several texts that he's written and produced with other scholars as well. In the bottom here, you can just click on these, and there's links to go where you can find to purchase them. The New Testament Apocrypha, and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, all this. See, look at it, secret revelation, secret scriptures revealed. This juicy, interesting books, guys. Go and check those out. And I'm telling you, you will be. This is worth it. This is a really good, interesting stuff. This is a high level scholar. Like we have scholars who translate stuff. Then there's scholars who our work off the backs of scholars who translate stuff, and he's one of the guys who's translating stuff. So I'm very thankful to have you on here, and it's my pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Neil. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about the Apocrypha and some of these texts that didn't make it into the canon of the church. They didn't make it into this, the Nicene Creed for whatever reason. And there's a lot of these. A lot of them found in Nag Hammadi. A lot of them they consider to be Gnostic or just not canon. But the one I'm particularly interested in that I want to start off with is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. So can you tell us about this text and what it's about and why is it not in the Bible?
Sure. I started getting interested in Infancy Gospel of Thomas when I was an undergrad, really, but then I launched off that into grad work. And it's this a text that fills in the gap between Matthew's and Luke's infancy stories of Jesus, and then the story of Jesus at the age of 12 in the temple in the Gospel of Luke. So it's Jesus from the ages of 5 to 12. And he does some things that one expects Jesus to do, like he does some healings, he does some resuscitations, but he also does some cursings. So we have blessings and cursings. The probably the most the best example of this is when one story where Jesus is walking through the marketplace and another boy bumps into him, and Jesus gets annoyed and just strikes him dead. So you don't want to tick off this Jesus, everyone at the end of each of these episodes, the people around him, the neighborhoods, the people, his neighbors, are all like, "Who is this person? How does he have these powers?" And when I started working on this text, I thought, well, you have all these scholars who say how terrible this is, how this is an indication of what all the weird Christians in antiquity believed. And it's the Jesus of the New Testament is nothing like that. But I thought, well, the people who wrote it must have thought it would made some sense to them. So I tried to treat it sympathetically. And my basic take on it was that, texts that are biographies in antiquity, they always show this consistency of character. So the adult person has all those qualities that we know of from their adult life as a child. So therefore, if you have a cursing child Jesus, the person who wrote it must think that the adult Jesus would curse as well. There's that consistency of character. And if you look in the New Testament, we do see Jesus occasionally do some nasty things. He curses a fig tree, for example. And if you look in the book of Acts, various apostles curse as well. Paul blinds one of his rivals. Two characters named Ananias and Sapphira are struck by a lightning bolt from the sky by God. Peter's involved, but it's mostly God doing it. There's lots of cursing in the New Testament. You just have to look a bit closely for it. So I just thought this text in antiquity made sense. And as it happens, when people talk about it in the first 9 centuries or so, various church fathers and such, they never complain about the cursing of Jesus in it. What they don't like is, they compare it to the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, it has that story of the wedding at Cana. And it says right after it that this is Jesus' first sign, his first miracle. So they object to any childhood stories because the Gospel of John says the first miracle was at Cana. So they have a theological reason not to like it, but they don't object to the curses, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And like you said, this isn't all everyone's accepted. We love just all about like love your neighbor, this, that. There are particular events in canon scripture where people get killed. Like Simon Magus is flying and he falls down because Peter curses him down. Or the couple, I forgot their name, Ananias, I think his name is, where they sell their house and they gave most of the money to the church, but they kept a little bit of it.
Yeah.
And they get killed for that. Like, this is strict. This is not like there's some strictness going on here. And so for Jesus to be portrayed that way, I think you make a good point. It's like they're not complaining about that. They just don't think it I think what you were saying is it doesn't line up theologically with the first miracle happening. It couldn't be before that, right?
Mm-hmm. And generally the church is developed where they like the Jesus who bounces children on his lap and says, blessed are the peacemakers, more than they like these little hints of a cursing Jesus. But I just think people in antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages, they just thought that a person who has power can use it whichever way they want to. Sometimes they curse, sometimes they bless. And you just need to be careful of people with power and don't cross them. And I think that's kind of what we see in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas.
Now, what do you think happened with these texts, and is there something about them that you think is why they're not preferred by the church a couple centuries down?
Well, I think we have to be careful. Like we tend to have this view that once the New Testament is formed, all the other stuff just gets thrown by the wayside.
Right.
And it gets rediscovered after the Renaissance, so 17th, 18th, 19th century and so on. But it's not really how things worked.
Right.
The church, all Christians throughout history, they've certainly put a lot of emphasis on the official canon, but they also read and came into contact with texts outside the canon. Kind of think of it as like a B-roll of sorts of material. And some of those apocryphal texts are more popular than the texts in the canon. And we can see it in the number of manuscripts we have. For example, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, there's not a lot of manuscripts of it in its original Greek, but there's lots in Latin, there's lots in Syriac. Another text, the Infancy Gospel of James, which talks about Mary's life before she was married to Joseph. There's somewhere around 160 Greek manuscripts alone, and then there's other translations and so on. These were very popular texts. And then we see stories of them in art, in iconography. People were exposed to them all the time. So I wonder if the regular everyday person not a theologian, not a someone in a monastery or whatever, would really know what's in the canon and what's not in the canon, not in it, because they see this stuff all the time around them. I use this example in my classes of there's a church in Switzerland in a small town named Zwingli. I think it's 11th century, and you can still go to it today. Small town, small church, and if you're a parishioner in that church, and maybe the priest's droning on in Latin, you get bored, so you start looking around the church, and you look up, and there's a whole bunch of ceiling tiles, and each of those ceiling tiles are a story about Jesus. One of them is a story that's from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It's where Jesus fashions some birds out of clay and then animates them. They become alive. And that's one of those images. So to a regular everyday person, that's just as canonical as all the other stories that are depicted in those tiles.
And if I'm not mistaken, this particular narrative winds up in the Quran.
Yep.
So this was a big deal. Which
shows you that Muslims who are telling these stories, or people before Muhammad who are telling these stories, they think that that's a common Christian story. That if they want to say stuff about Jesus, that's one of them that they pick. So it must have been, fairly prevalent in the area of this around the time.
And that's what I think so fascinating about that is it demonstrates, like, it literally proves how widespread this particular story was. If there's Christian Arabs and Christians in Egypt, that Nag Hammadi is not too far away from Mecca. I mean, not close, but like you could see that there's probably traveling going on between the two. They're not that far away, but and then you mentioned where was this church at again?
Switzerland.
So we're talking all these different areas on the Roman world map where this story is known. Mm-hmm. And also it's really interesting. It shows that Jesus has like divine powers, like he can give life. So there's that when we talk about this debate between like Ebionite Christians and Marcionites and these different, like, how divine is Jesus? Is he God? Is he Son of God? Is he just a Messiah? Well, it's like, who else has the power to just create life out of non-life? Mm-hmm. And any other, not really much. There's really nothing. I don't think Moses can do that, right?
Yeah, there's some messing around with staffs becoming snakes.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But that's a magician's trick. But yeah, certainly he's elevated in the story to a divine status. And this text, we think, is probably one of the earliest apocryphal texts we have, somewhere around mid-2nd century or so. So it was never, of course, considered valuable enough to be part of the canon. But again, it still gets copied and transmitted and made into art and made into plays and all this other stuff, even though it wasn't official scripture.
That's very interesting. We do have a super chat, and thank you for the super chats. Anybody, feel free to ask questions. If there isn't any other super chats and I see it, I'll definitely ask it. And so even if you don't send a super chat, you can ask questions. And like I said, if I see them, I'll definitely ask them. Yakuvi, thank you for the super chat. Says, does Dr. Burke know how wide known the Gospel of Mary was, or was this not widely known?
Thanks for the question. I'm not sure how widely known to your audience Gospel of Mary is, so let me just say a little bit about it.
Yeah.
So this is it's a text written in Greek, but the largest portion that we have of it, and we only have portions, is in Coptic, and it's found in a book that is not part of the Nag Hammadi library, but it tends to get associated with it because similar ideas and because it's Coptic, and so it comes from around the same place in the world as the Nag Hammadi library. So we don't have the entire text, but in the text part that we have, Mary is telling the apostles about a vision that she had of Jesus. And in this vision, Jesus talks about how the soul ascends from the earth up into the heavens, which happens when one dies or achieves gnosis and then comes back down to earth. So basically, there are gatekeepers along the way, and you have to give them special secret passwords. So this is all the teaching of the text. And then as she finishes the text, the apostles say, this sounds like strange teaching. And Peter, portrayed as a bit of a chauvinist, says, why should we listen to this woman? And then another apostle comes to her defense and says, well, Jesus loved her more than any of us. And so there's a split in the apostles, but some support Mary and some don't. So it's fascinating text because of this dynamic that we seem to see here between a patriarchal kind of Catholic Christianity, right, which is represented by Peter, and a more egalitarian, proto-feminist Christianity represented by Mary Magdalene. Or should just say Mary, because we don't know if it's Mary Magdalene or Mary of Bethany or the Virgin Mary. It's never specified. But it's usually assumed that it's Mary Magdalene. And some people take from this Jesus loved her more than us, that is a hint that Jesus was married to her, which I don't buy, but that's part of the discussion. So how widely known was it? Well, until we found this manuscript, which was in the late 19th century, I think late 1800s or early 1900s, no one had ever heard of it before. So we have lots of testimony about texts in antiquity. We have church fathers who will mention texts that they don't like Gospel of Thomas or Acts of Peter or whatever. And we have canon lists, so canon lists will list all the texts that are considered scripture, and then they'll list a bunch of texts that are not considered scripture. Gospel of Mary does not appear in any of these. So we didn't know about it until we found this manuscript. And now we have a couple of scraps in Greek as well as the Coptic, but not widely known in the sense that people in antiquity were talking about it, and not widely known in the sense that we don't have very much evidence of it anymore. So it's one of these rare examples where something appears and it's like, wow, we've never seen that before. But it'd be nice to know, all of our evidence, all of our knowledge for antiquity is partial, right? Just because we only have these fragments doesn't mean that it couldn't have had some more wide dissemination, but we just don't seem to have much evidence that is indeed the case.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one of the things that you pointed out that I think is the most fascinating about this text is it seems like it recognizes this patriarchal church of Rome, I guess, like you said, represented by Peter himself, mm-hmm. which I almost got to wonder, was that on purpose? Are they saying that Peter represents this church of Rome, and then Mary represents this sort of spirit of wisdom, Sophia, or the faith, I guess, like the more like the real faith in Jesus, and not just the powerful church, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think this. Whenever I see a character in a Christian text, whether it's in the canon or not, I always think first that they may represent a group, because Christians did seem to do that. Texts with Peter's name either represent a Jewish form of Christianity or Roman Christianity. Texts with the name of Thomas tend to be associated with Syriac Christianity. John, maybe Asia Minor. Things like that. It's not applied hard and fast. Like everyone seems to like using Peter, but we do have some texts that are Jewish Christian where he's a champion, and James as well sometimes. And so it's really interesting to me when we get some Christian figures like Peter and Mary in an argument with one another. And to me, that suggests that we're looking at groups using figures to represent their own theology and have them battle one another. Just like the communities are in conversation, in conflict with one another. So even look at, say, the canonical Gospel of John. We have several characters in there that could represent communities, including Thomas. And when I talk about Gospel of Thomas in my classes, I like to highlight this idea that we have a text called the Gospel of Thomas, which seems to have no interest at all in the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And then in the Gospel of John, we have a character named Thomas who doubts the resurrection. So I wonder, is this also reflecting a group connected with Thomas, even as early as the Gospel of John, which is a possibility? So I think Christians really like to think with characters, think with narratives. And so often our texts reflect these real life conflicts between communities.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And so another one of your books Secret Scriptures Revealed. One of the questions that you approach is reading these texts harmful to personal faith?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really interesting question. Where did you come up with when you were thinking about this question?
Right. So the Secret Scriptures Revealed book, I was asked to do a short introduction to Apocrypha. So it's about 150 pages, so it's a nice little book, and it's cheap. If you're interested in a good little introduction. And one of the things that the publisher asked me to do is to talk about certain issues related to Apocrypha. And I'm not sure if I came up with the question, is it harmful to faith or not? They may have. It was a press that deals with, it's a theological press. It's Erdman. So it's not just for people who are believers, but certainly a lot of the people who read their books are believers. And I had to approach the question honestly. And I think my answer was yes and no. And I talk about my own background in this. I was raised in a Catholic family, but a kind of a small C Catholic family, which means we hardly ever went to church.
Yeah, same with mine.
Yeah. And when I came into university, I wasn't initially interested in religious studies. I was interested in English literature, but then I added religious studies courses. And I was blown away by my first classes where they're talking about such things as, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. The four Gospels are not actually written by apostles, and all this other stuff that was challenging to my knowledge of Christianity, but also my faith as it's related to Christianity. And I felt somewhat cheated by it, that some things had not been revealed to me. But that's Catholicism. My wife goes to a United Church, and this kind of stuff is part of the discussion sometimes. It's and other churches are more open to metaphor and less into literal approaches. So it's less shocking to people who come from those kinds of backgrounds. So when it comes to Apocrypha, by extension, when people start to get introduced to this, it depends where they're coming from. If they've heard nothing about apocryphal texts growing up in their Christian denomination, then it could be a bit of a shock. Or they go see the Da Vinci Code, which was about 12 years ago now, but that was a big shock when that came out. People are introduced to these texts that they never heard anything about, that apparently say that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
So that can be to some people that was a crisis of faith. So you had all of these books being published by mostly evangelical scholars saying, don't read this stuff, it's crap, just read the Bible. And in part, some of my work has been a reaction to these evangelical or theological scholars who are writing against Apocrypha in a modern context and trying to show how they're constructing their arguments, which is a lot like ancient church fathers who would do the same, like people like Irenaeus or Hippolytus, who would try to get their parishioners not to read apocryphal texts either. So yes and no, in the sense that if you're open to different interpretations that don't challenge your own necessarily, but might inform your own or grow your own, then it's not a big deal at all. But if you feel like I did, that this stuff has been kept from you, then you start to think, well, why are people doing that? Why shouldn't I be reading this? And why is it that they're telling me that certain things are fact which don't seem to be fact?
Wow, that's a really good point. And it's definitely, I think the ironic thing about it is not even just the Apocrypha, but like the heretical stuff that we get from Irenaeus and Hippolytus that accidentally gets passed down through them quoting it, and or else it would have been lost. And we get to read these things, and we also find out there's another side of Christianity that's long been forgotten about that seems to be more likable in a lot of ways. Not putting down the church or anything, but like just being real, just from my honest opinion, they seem to be more like a realistic approach to how religion should be done,
Well, certainly if you don't like the trappings and the excess of Catholicism in particular, but also Greek Orthodoxy and others, where you see all this opulence, and you think, well, shouldn't we be doing what Jesus did and be good to poor people and be charitable and so on? So there's that disconnect. the Gnostics never got to that point, or well, let's think about Gnostic Christians for a second. So people who like the Gospel of Mary, right. They were people who would talk about Jesus and construct stories in order to articulate their points of view, kind of extracurricularly. They would go to regular church too, but they'd gather outside of that and talk about these things in different ways. So they never got to be the ones in power. And maybe if they did, they would have started to be corrupted by the world and so on. But though, keep in mind, Gnosticism was all about being against the corruption of the world. So maybe they wouldn't have gotten that way. So that's a good point. There's one thing about the Gospel of Mary, again, to illustrate a point here. There's some things in these texts which are quite attractive to modern readers, like the equality of Mary in the group. It's great, to have women and men in having authority. Right. But most people then ignore the rest of the text with all of that stuff about traveling up into the heavens with the gatekeepers and so on. That stuff's weird. We'll just set that aside. But we really like the stuff at the end where Mary has a fight with Peter. So there are parts of Gnosticism and some heretical forms of Christianity which are quite attractive to moderns, but there's some stuff that I think many people who look at it today would rather not fuss with. It's tricky. It's tricky stuff.
You're right. It's very complicated. I like that answer. That was well said. Vesper, thank you for the super chat. I really appreciate it. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas has the birth of Jesus being foretold by a prophecy of Zoroaster. Can you elaborate upon that?
Sure, but it's actually not in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It's in another Infancy Gospel, which we usually call the Arabic Infancy Gospel, just because it's not a great name for it. It was originally Syriac and then translated into Arabic, but we have to figure out ways to keep things separate, right? Yeah. And there is a portion in it that talks about Jesus being predicted by Zoroaster, and it suggests that whoever wrote that text, which is probably somewhere in the Eastern Syrian area, and then coming down into Arabic lands, was kind of rubbing shoulders with Zoroastrians and certainly wanted to show that Jesus is in some way either superior to Zoroastrianism or is the culmination of Zoroastrianism. And we see quite a lot of that in other texts as well. There are various so-called pagan or non-Christian philosophers and writers who are said to be predicting Jesus. Either, and that means they're playing fast and loose with what the actual person said. It's a real thing that they said, or they make up something. Christians make up something that is supposed to be said by these people that predicts Jesus or talks about Jesus. So certainly we have to take these things with a grain of salt. These are Christians saying things about Jesus as being better than all of these other religions and philosophies and so on. So chances are it's an invention by Christians as a reaction to interaction with these other religious faiths.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, in the Zoroastrian theology, there was supposed to be a descendant of Zoroaster to be the next coming Messiah. No, I don't know what they call it Messiah, but the next great prophet or whatever. But what I noticed about this, and I didn't even know about this, I'm just speculating here because I never read this yet. But what I noticed just about the question itself is it reminds me of Luke, where you have the three Magi.
Matthew.
Or Matthew, I'm sorry, Matthew. Yeah, thank you for correcting me. Where the three Magi see the star and know that there's going to be and so the Magi, by extension, are related to the Zoroastrian world. That's what Magi pretty much are. So I wonder if that's where they're sort of reflecting off that, saying he's not just the Jewish Messiah, he's a world Messiah. Even the Zoroastrians are looking for this guy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really interesting way to put it. Yeah.
And we have some other apocryphal texts that flesh out the story of the Magi. There's one called the Revelation of the Magi. Another one's Legend of Aphrodisias. But it tells us about the story about the Magi in Persia and how they got started on their way to eventually end up in Bethlehem for the story. So, the one thing that Apocrypha does is fill in gaps, right? So the New Testament, we have these 4 Gospels. They're not very long. And they say almost nothing about Jesus' childhood and so on. Nothing at all about his teenage years and lots of other gaps. And so we today
Ready
may
to
ask
scare.
the same kinds of questions, right? Why is it that the Magi came to Bethlehem? What did Jesus do when he was a teenager? And so we have all these texts that try to fill in something there, but also do other things at the same time. They're not just giving in facts; they're telling, they're presenting ideas, right? So with the Zoroaster thing, it's something called supersessionism, saying that Christianity is better than other faiths, and so they're trying to make that point at the same time,
Right.
as saying stuff about the Magi.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And thank you for that great question, by the way. Thank you for that. There's another one now from Gaius Julius Windex. Thank you for, yeah, he's one of my members too. Thank you for the super chat. Would you consider the shepherd of shepherd of Germans? Oh, he's got a correction underneath. Shepherd of Hermas.
Yeah.
So there's the correction underneath. I see that. Okay. Shepherd of Hermas as apocryphal.
Generally, I don't. Because I have a certain definition of apocryphal, which I'll have to paraphrase, but it's stories about Jesus, by or about Jesus and his immediate followers. So that can include family as well as apostles. So by and about. Hermas, who's credited with this very long visionary text, is not one of those people. Well, there is a Hermas that's mentioned either in one of Paul's letters or the Book of Acts. I can't remember which one, but it's not clear that that's supposed to be the same person. So if the text is not credited to a first century figure who knew Jesus, then I wouldn't consider it apocryphal. But about the text, it's certainly non-canonical. It's not in the Bible. It was very popular. We have more manuscripts of the Shepherd of Hermas in papyri, so little fragmentary bits and pieces here and there from the first several centuries, than almost any text, canonical and non-canonical. Very, very popular. But never reached, it doesn't seem to have passed the first 4 centuries or so. Like after that point, it just doesn't seem to survive very well. So we have lots of early manuscripts of it, but no medieval manuscripts, and as far as I remember. And so it had to be recovered through archaeological discoveries and so on. So really an interesting text, but it's all about visions of the future, about visions of the church and so on. So it doesn't really tell stories about Jesus when he was alive. It doesn't have Jesus coming back and revealing things. It's this visionary, probably of the 2nd century, being given these revelations by God, and it just unfolds over this very, very long text.
Wow. Thank you for that. Thank you for the question. And if I'm not mistaken, that one almost made it to canon.
It was highly esteemed. So people in the 4th century, when they're talking about the canon, we'll mention that as a possibility. It's something that some people value, some people don't. And then you have people who says, well, it's okay to read, but it's not really scripture. And then it just kind of fades out from there.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for the question. There's another one that I just saw, and hope I don't skip anybody. Okay, here it is. Imposter Suspense. Thank you for the super chat. Who were the Desert Fathers?
So these are ascetics, monastics, who withdrew from society and go out into the desert. And this happens around the 4th century. And basically when the church becomes first considered acceptable, so by Constantine, and then about less than a century later, it becomes the official religion of the empire. It starts to gather this opulence that I was mentioning about earlier. And some Christians didn't like that. They didn't think that that's the role that Christianity should take.
Yeah.
It's not. It shouldn't be of the world. It shouldn't be mixed in the world. So somewhat like the Gnostics about keeping the matter and the world separate from spiritual things. So the Desert Fathers said, screw this. We're going out into the desert. We're going to leave the cities completely, and we're going to go live in these caves and commune with God. And so we get lots of stories that start to get told about them, because they become these kind of superheroic figures, these athletes for
wandering ascetics.
Yeah. And so people would come out and see them, and sometimes the Desert Fathers don't really want people to come see them. And sometimes they get so popular that the church wants to make them into priests or bishops, and they're reluctant to do so. These are these figures that are just on the outside, and eventually there's almost like a kind of a compromise where you get monastic communities growing around them, which become monasteries. So now you get these ascetics not living alone in caves, but living together in a community, and that has a bit more contact with the cities than just the ascetics in the individual caves. So there's a kind of different ranges of ascetic here, where you get these people all alone in the desert, in the caves, and then you have these monasteries where they're still removed, but they're together and they're creating things for the settled communities in the cities. So, they're creating texts, scriptures, they're doing these other things. So there's more interaction. But the Desert Fathers, generally we consider the people who are off in their own little caves, like Anthony, for example, is a major one.
I was able to pull up a couple of depictions on some artists, probably like late Middle Ages, maybe medieval, but they're always showing them like looking, like you said, looking like bishops or priests, or like looking real savvy, Mm-hmm. But it's like you said, it's interesting how they were depicted as like these like very pious, very wandering ascetic types Christians that are like, that was a great question. The next one is from Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners. Jason would love to hear Dr. Burke's thoughts on the secret gospel of Mark. Great question.
Okay. Secret gospel of Mark. Let me tell you what it is first for people who aren't aware of it. About, what was it? Can't remember the year, but it's middle of the 20th century. A scholar named Morton Smith was going around to various monasteries and cataloging the materials that they had there. And he came across this book. It's a 17th century copy of, printed copy of works by Ignatius. And in the back pages, because sometimes even in modern books, you get some blank pages at the back, someone had copied by hand in Greek a letter by Clement of Alexandria that no one had ever seen before. And in this letter, Clement talks about another version of the Gospel of Mark, which he calls either secret or mystical Mark. And he gives two excerpts from it. One is a bit lengthy. It involves a resurrection story, a bit like the story of Lazarus from the Gospel of John. And then another one is just a little bit of a sequel to it. Clement in the text is saying these portions don't belong to the original Gospel of Mark. And he's talking about this group called the Carpocratians, who have an even longer version that has some stuff in it that he doesn't appreciate. Now, the thing about the Lazarus story, it has what some people consider homoerotic qualities to it. Jesus is interacting with this young man that he raises from the grave. He comes to him the young man comes to Jesus at night, dressed in nothing but a linen cloth, and Jesus spends the night. He spends the night with Jesus. That's the term. That's the phrase. Learning about the kingdom of God. I think homoeroticism is in the eye of the beholder. That sounds to me more like an initiate coming to his master, dressed in initiate's kind of a robe. Ancient baptism, you'd dress in just a linen robe. You'd go naked into the water, and you come out and you have another type of robe on. So it reflects transformation. So people who see the homoeroticism in it think that this was not an authentic text. It cannot be an ancient text. This reflects a way of imagining homosexuality that you didn't see in the ancient world. So they think Morton Smith created the text because rumor has it that he was gay. So, of course, the belief is that gays are all trying to make us all gay. And so he created this text. There's a small number of scholars who think that it is authentic, and I think their arguments are much stronger than the people who say that it's not authentic. And I think mostly, again, it's the declaration of its inauthenticity is motivated by theological interests. They don't like the contents, so therefore it must be fake. But I think the evidence is really good that Smith did indeed find this text, and the evidence is strong that he worked on it for a really long time to try and figure out how to translate it appropriately, and then he published it, and then there's been this debate about it ever since.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, there was the apostle whom Jesus loved character. We don't really know exactly who it is. Some people think it might be John. Some people don't. Maybe Peter, but like sort of a mystery. And then there's one particular verse that I'm thinking about is when they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the officers arrive, the Romans, whoever, and it says that there was a young boy running with he was only wearing a linen cloth.
Yep.
So maybe this is some truth behind this thing. Maybe there was a character around these disciples, like you said. Maybe he was initiate. I'm not saying anything crazy. I'm just looking at the text.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's what it was.
Yeah, the story of the young man with the linen cloth. People don't know what to do with that. We think that Matthew and Luke copied Mark, and they did not copy that portion. They didn't know what to do with it either. So they just left that out. But when we put those pieces from the Clement of Alexandria's letter into the Gospel of Mark, that story starts to make a bit more sense. It's like, oh, that's the guy from earlier. So I think that's an interesting quality of it. There's something else you said at the beginning of the comment there, but now I've lost it. But yeah, let's move on.
Well, let's talk about the gospel whom Jesus loved. Maybe that was.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, if you want to look for homoeroticism, go to the Gospel of John. This gospel, the apostle Jesus loved reclining on his breast during the Last Supper. Now, imagine if we didn't have the Gospel of John, and then a piece of it was found with that Last Supper scene, with the gospel, the disciple that Jesus loved. People would immediately say, that's got to be fake.
Right.
That's homoerotic. Jesus was not gay, blah, 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 blah. But, we are used to that text, and we understand how we think best to interpret it. But I don't think it's any more or less homoerotic than, say, the Gospel of Secret Mark.
And I think a lot of these later artists in medieval Europe, like there's a lot. This is one of many of depictions of who this disciple was, hanging on Jesus with his arms around him, like this. And I'm not saying that's a bad depiction, because when you read John, that's what it seems like. It seems like this. He's all there. This is Jesus. He's higher up in Jesus's eyes. Like, he loves this disciple, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, it's kind of a mystery, I think. So I don't think you could say either way what this is. But yeah, I don't think it's out of the ordinary. Or I don't think it's I don't think it's that crazy to think that there could have been something, homoerotic going on there. The next question was from Jesus Saves. Thank you for the super chat. What is the Gospel of Judas?
Right. So this is another text fairly recently found. It's only been, I think it was 2008, maybe a little bit earlier. We've always known that there was a Gospel of Judas in antiquity. So it's not like the same situation with the Gospel of Mary, which we don't have any record of it. Irenaeus talks about the Gospel of Judas. He describes it a little bit. But we'd never had a copy of this thing until fairly recently. It's in rough shape. It's not been preserved well. It was found in a tomb, probably in Egypt, and then got put on the antiquities market and not treated very well by the people who owned it before it was eventually sold to a foundation that's preserved it. And it's a bit, you can compare it again to the Gospel of Mary. It's got some interesting stuff about Jesus and the apostles, and it's got a whole bunch of this esoteric Gnostic stuff, which, again, most people not sure what to do with. I mean, by most people who aren't scholars, they kind of set that aside, but they do focus on Jesus and the apostles and the dynamic with Judas, which is, of course, the most interesting stuff. But this too seems to be written by a group that has some antipathy towards Catholic Christianity or the developing Roman Church, and presents the apostles as quite negative. There's a scene in there where it's a dream sequence, but the apostles are doing all these terrible things. I don't recall, but they're portrayed very negatively. But the interesting thing is, what do you do with Judas? Because Judas is set apart from those, and scholars differ over whether he's presented heroically or just as villainous as he is in the canonical Gospels. And the first people who took a crack at translating the text, they said he's portrayed positively. And there's this one particular portion that's got a bit of a gap in it. So, all the interesting bits always have a bit of a gap. But it says something about, here's the apostles over here. You will surpass them. Oh, sorry. Here's the apostles. You see them here. They're horrible people. You will surpass them. So Judas is better than them. His role to make sure Jesus gets sacrificed or gets handed over, this was something he was expected to do. He was doing his job. He's a hero. But then other people started looking at it and they said, no, you got that wrong. What the text is actually saying is, look at the apostles over here. They're terrible. You will surpass them in villainy. You will be worse than them.
Wow.
And so Judas is not heroic after all. So that's the part of the text that I think is most interesting to people. And to me is this conflict about how these groups are represented in different ways. So Judas, I wouldn't say he's representing another Christian group, but he does have this interesting role that's set apart from the apostles, who the author does not like. But he doesn't like Judas either. So he's just kind of a vehicle for getting these ideas across on the part of the writer.
Yeah, and I think about Judas, and it's like you could see it makes it very clear in the text that Jesus knows he's got a betrayer amongst them. He knows it's Judas. He can see the future. He knows what's going to happen. So then you almost have to ask yourself: is this part of his plan to use Judas to be this sort of piece of the puzzle? And then you had Judas after all this repenting and then hanging himself. Mm-hmm. So you're like, does he deserve to be villainized for that? He does repent. He does admit that this was the Christ. I mean, he doesn't say that, but like he probably thinks that. You know what I mean?
In retrospect, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting character because if you think of God as directing everything, right? Providence, everything is directed by God. Judas's role was directed by God. He had to be the guy. He has no idea he's being directed by God. And so he thinks he's making his own choices. If this is your theology, I mean. Yeah. But he's villainized for doing this, even though he's needed to make this divine drama unfold, right? We need a betrayer. Jesus is aware that he's going to betray him. He allows it to happen. God allows it to happen, etc. And then, of course, poor Judas kills himself after. So he's this villain that goes down in history as being this horrible figure. Though in modern interpretations or tellings of the story, like Jesus Christ Superstar or the Last Temptation of Christ, Judas is portrayed in a much more gray, kind of nuanced way. And I think moderns, I think we like our gray figures. We like our anti-heroes. We like our people with layers. And so they cast Judas in this much more interesting way than he has been over antiquity and medieval period.
It's like in Game of Thrones, where you have like Cersei Lannister, and you have these characters that are they're pretty wicked. They do some really evil stuff, but there's like, you get to know them and you start to understand their characters, and you can't help but to root for them a little bit, and like hope for their survival. You hope they go to the good side, like all that stuff. Like, and you're right, we love those kind of characters. Mm-hmm. There's another good question. I'm not sure this is in your area of expertise, but it's worth asking. It says, if Judaism was influenced by Zoroastrian, do we have a reason to believe the sacred Hyoma plant was preserved in some way?
I have no idea what a sacred Hyoma plant is.
Yeah, it's so in the Zendavesta, I think it was a cup though. I'm not sure if it's a plant. I could be wrong. Maybe it's something he knows. But there was a cup called the Hyoma, and and Zoroaster is rushed on by Angramanu, and he drinks from the cup of the word of Hora Mazda, and he's like repelling. So yeah. I only know that because I read it, but I'm not an expert on the text, so I can't answer that question. But yeah, I didn't know if you knew anything about that or not, so we could just go.
No, sorry about that.
Yeah. So I think that might be the last. If there's any more questions, I'm looking to see if there's anything. But as far as that goes, here it is. Here's another question. Interesting idea that Lazarus is the disciple whom Jesus loved, as it does say Jesus loved Lazarus. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you're mentioning the different interpretations of who the disciple Jesus loved is. And John is the usual one, and he's the one whose name gets put on the text at some point. Lazarus is another one. he is described as being someone that Jesus loved earlier in the text. That's a possibility. Can't remember who else is mentioned, but there's the story. There's these 7 apostles at the very end of the Gospel of John who are fishing, and some of them are named. So Peter's named. Can't remember who else is named, but a few are unnamed. And as Jesus is talking to these apostles at the seaside, at some point he's talking to Peter and he says, "That guy, the one whom I love, the beloved disciple," and then talks about him. So it's not Peter, can't be Peter, but it doesn't seem to be the other people who are named either. So there's these 2 mysterious figures who are unnamed that presumably the beloved disciple is, but we don't know who it is. Certainly the writer knew who he meant. The community probably knew who he meant, but we don't. And as I said, eventually the name John gets attached to the text, and John is one of the people that was at the seashore in the story, but I think the beloved disciple is more likely to be one of those other 2 people. It could very well be Lazarus. It's one of these mysteries that are just left dangling for us to try to figure out.
This is a comment that I thought was interesting, and I wonder. I'm not really familiar with the Gospel of Judas, but is he really depicted as a green man with horns in this?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, all right. Just wanted to check that out. Thought was interesting. So now, since we don't have any current questions, I just want to jump back to these Apocrypha texts. And do you think there's like, when these texts are getting written out, I want to say like 2nd century, like mid-2nd century, when these texts are really starting to be written, do you think that there's like different regions, like Syriacs are doing certain texts, maybe they have a certain gospel, maybe in Egypt there's other types of Christianities? Do you think that's how this gets pieced out, or do you think there's like sort of a blend of Christianities all over the place?
The traditional way of looking at Christian history we get from a writer named Eusebius of Caesarea, and he says basically Jesus taught the disciples, and then the disciples taught their followers until we get the church in my day, my church, the Roman church in his day. So it's an unbroken line of succession. These days, most scholars say it didn't quite work that way. What you ended up with is that Jesus taught people, including his apostles, and they taught other people. And then there's all these little communities that pop up here and there that it's all quite wild. There's no central authority. There can't be, because Christianity is just growing wild around the empire. It's an underground kind of movement. And then in the 4th century, around Eusebius' day, there's a push to try and create something called an orthodox viewpoint. Like, this is the right view and everyone else is wrong. So 3 centuries or so of wild transmission, evangelization, invention, and so on. And then start to focus more starting in the 4th century. Each of these communities would articulate their view of Jesus in their own particular way. Both in whenever they would meet together, tell stories, but also when they write texts. So the more views you have of Jesus, the more text you have expressing more views of Jesus. So it's quite wild. And so this is why these texts have these conflicts that I was talking about, with various people representing various figures. So there is this sense, certainly in some portions of the empire, that a particular apostle evangelized that area, and that's their chosen apostle, and they will write texts featuring that apostle. And Thomas is the best example of that. And these texts seem to be connected with Syria. So we have the Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Thomas, a book called the Book of Thomas, not the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, that's different. But these texts which seem to share some ideas, some theology, and they seem to come from a particular area, which is Syria. It's harder to pinpoint that kind of stuff elsewhere. In Egypt, it's much more intellectual kind of center and a lot more mystical and esoteric. So that's why we get the Nag Hammadi materials coming from there, which they don't seem to have spread pretty much outside of Egypt, at least that we can tell. But we also have lots of other texts that were written in Egypt that are also not in the Bible, but are less esoteric or less Gnostic than the Nag Hammadi texts. But I think we need to think of people sharing this material. Like, we don't just have the Gnostics reading their texts in Egypt, and then the Orthodox reading authoritative scripture, and then this other stuff in between. This stuff would all been swirling around everybody. And most texts were written in monasteries. And we have a head of a monastery named Shanuta. That's the head of the monastery. And he writes these texts saying that people should not be reading Apocrypha. Yet many of the manuscripts that we have that are apocryphal come from his monastery. So that tells us either people aren't listening to him, or what he considers Apocrypha is not necessarily what we might say so today. It's always a thing I say where one person's scripture is another person's Apocrypha and vice versa. So what I like is scripture. What you like and I don't like you is Apocrypha. And so Shanuta, he liked canonical texts, but he also liked, or his people within his community liked, some apocryphal texts. But then there was this other stuff that they didn't like. And so that's the bad stuff. My stuff is good. Your stuff is bad. So again, I mentioned earlier the kind of blurry line between apocryphal and canonical stuff. There's also blurry lines between sets of apocryphal texts that some people value, but other people don't.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I couldn't help but to think about there's also another blurry line happening between Middle Platonism and Judaism. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these groups, like the Nacenes, pop in my mind right away. There's also another group that you mentioned, Carfinians. What are they?
Carpocratians.
Carpocratians, yeah. And so these types of groups, when you look at what they're doing, they seem to be taking like maybe a more universal approach rather than this is like a Jewish thing. They're seeing it as like, this is just the true religion. I'm not saying that they're pagan Christians or anything, or they're just, this is the way they see the divine is not particular to any religion or mystery or cult, or like the Nacenes are like, yeah, you were once called Osiris to the Egyptians. You were also once called Pappus and Attis, but like you're Jesus. They thought those were your guys, but they really knew it was the whole time it was just Jesus. Mm-hmm. I think that's interesting. So I wonder what you think about that, about these sort of different groups that no one knows about. And can you tell us a little bit about them too?
Well, let me talk about what you talked about with Plato. We should never think of that religions in antiquity as being, kind of firmly boundaried.
Right.
And the viewer of minutes ago was mentioning Zoroastrianism and how Judaism was influenced by Zoroastrianism, essentially during the Babylonian exile. And so, Judaism took on some aspects of Babylonian culture, and even the story of creation from Genesis was taken over from Egyptian religion. So religions just kind of borrow and take and adapt stuff all the time. In first century ancient world, Judaism was interested in Platonism to some extent. We have Philo of Alexandria, Jewish character living in Egypt, and he tried to articulate the creation story through a Platonic lens. In Platonism, for example, you have a heavenly realm and an earthly realm, and there's a god who is up in the heavenly realm, and then there's a god in the lower realm. Philo didn't go so far as to say there were two separate gods, but he did have a very Platonic kind of way of looking at things. And that's what we expect, that people will adapt as they come into contact with other religions and other ways of thinking. And Christians, even Orthodox Christians, were interested in Platonism. Gnostic Christians, what we generally call Gnostic Christians, were more enamored with Platonism than, say, Orthodox Christians, though everyone dabbled in it a little bit. Platonism was the thing of the day. It was trendy. So people like Justin Martyr, Tertullian, they had a bit of a line in the sand where they didn't want to cross. And that line in the sand was mostly, there's only one God. Gnostics went a bit full bore into Platonism and said there are two gods. There's a god of the heavenly realm, god of the earthly realm. God of the earthly realm is a bad guy, and the world that we live in is a prison. Now, there's been a tendency to think that the Gnostics were weird and they're out there and crazy or whatever, but actually they are more in their willingness to adapt Platonism as much as they are connecting with the popular culture of their day. They are more like the rest of the world than, say, Christians and more stringent Jews are. So they are not the weirdos so much. The Orthodox are more the weirdos by being more restrictive about their dabbling with Platonism. So you do get these various groups who are identified, who, like the Carpocratians and various other ones, usually named after someone who's their leader, who will bring in Platonism more than others, and they will get criticized by the Orthodox. Tertullian had a famous statement that what's the phrase? What does Jerusalem have to do with Alexandria? I think that was it. So he's more affirming the Jewishness of Christianity than the Greco-Roman or the pagan form of Judaism, though he too dabbled in Platonism to some extent. So it's all a matter of degree. Gnostics were much more interested in adapting Platonism than Orthodox Christians were, but everyone was playing with it a little bit.
Yeah, and I just found out about these Carpocratians, and I'm surprised that we're talking about it, because I was just talking to another scholar last night who I did a pre-recorded episode with, M. David Litwa. So anyone who's watching, be on the lookout for this. It's coming out soon, where it looks like they were deifying people who they felt were like they reached gnosis. So there was a young 18-year-old, can't remember his name, it's in the video. He was deified. They thought he reached gnosis. But they had like Jesus was the highest of all. He's the greatest example of how to live, how to reach gnosis. But they also were like venerating Plato and Pythagoras as like great prophets of the time. And like, this is Christianity. This is not like, they're real Christians. They're real Bible believing Christians that this is just how they felt. Mm-hmm. When I look at this, a lot of Orthodox or even like Protestants today would probably say that's nonsense. That is so heretical. But I'm looking at this like, why? What's the big deal? This is what they feel. This is what they believe in. What's the difference between what they're believing in and what you're believing in? You know?
Yeah, it's kind of relativistic. Everyone has their own particular faith and set of beliefs and so on. And why is theirs any different or any less valuable than others? And that's a kind of a scholarly view. So when it comes to studying Apocrypha, that kind of informs the way Apocrypha scholars work. We're not valuing those texts any differently than canonical texts. They're not any better or any more truthful than any others. Everyone just is writing their ideas down and trying to figure out their place in the world and how God relates to humans, et cetera, but no one is necessarily presenting truth, or at least not from a scholar's perspective. We're supposed to maintain this objectivity. Some of us have more trouble than others in doing that, but that is essentially the goal of not placing value upon the various articulations of Christianity, but studying them for what they have to say, and in some ways appreciating them for their own, appreciating all of their variety.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to put it. We cover a lot of grounds here. There was a comment that I thought is interesting, and I wonder if this is true or not. Is it true that Valentinus is the one that baptized Constantine, or do you not know?
No, Valentinus was a bit too early for that. Valentinus is a mid-2nd century guy. It's right. Constantine was not a Christian until his deathbed baptism. That's true. So he seemed to see some value in Christianity and allowing it to flourish, but he was not a baptized Christian himself. That's true.
That would be interesting if it was like a Gnostic Christian that baptized him. That just gets like stuck in history as like a fun fact, but I don't know. Yeah. But go ahead. We were going to say something.
I was just going to say again, if you're Constantine and you want everyone to listen to the emperor, Gnosticism is not the way to go.
Right. Exactly. It's not it doesn't work out that way.
No. The powers of the world are archons. They're evil. They represent an evil creator. You don't have to listen to them.
Yeah, you can't teach your people how to hate you.
No, it doesn't help.
Yeah, so it sort of makes sense why Gnosticism didn't win over what we now call Orthodox, or But this is the website, guys. The link is in the description, and I found while we were doing this, I found a quote from Bart Ehrman about your book, Secret Scriptures Revealed, and my audience loved Bart Ehrman, so I'm going to read it out loud. Tony Burke has long established himself as a master of the Christian Apocrypha, writings that did not make it into the New Testament. With secret scriptures revealed, he has made his massive knowledge of the field available to a broad general audience in a readable, informed, and enjoyable overview that will long be cherished by both beginners and devotees. That is from the great Bart Ehrman. So, guys, this book is in the link that's in there. Check it out, as long as and as well as others too. You could get this right here, the New Testament Apocrypha. What's in this book, for example?
Well, most collections of Apocrypha that are out there, like Ehrman's Lost Scriptures, for example, focus on texts that were written in the first 4 centuries the most. What we do with the New Testament Apocrypha, more non-canonical scriptures series, so there's 2 volumes out, there's the 3rd one on the way, is we look at texts that mostly are not in those first 3 or 4 centuries, though that are nevertheless very popular and important. So this is some texts that have never been published before, or were published, say, 100 years ago based on 1 or 2 manuscripts, and now we have more manuscripts, so we can do more. So new texts, new discussions of some older texts. So each one has about 30 texts in it, and they're all very, very interesting. And this is a multi-author collection, so I'm the editor. I do a few of the texts in it, but there's lots of other people who have contributed to those volumes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of really good translations of Coptic and Gnostic, or not Apocrypha, I should say, not Gnostic, but a lot of that stuff is found within these books. So go check out this website, do a little shopping, buy it a gift for somebody. Maybe someone you know might be interested. Maybe you already have it, but someone else that you're thinking of might want it. Check it out, and definitely worth checking out, guys. I'm telling you, this is top of the line material. And I'm really glad that I got to connect with you today and get you on the channel. Hopefully we can do this again going forward. And yeah, I would love to introduce you to some other scholars that I know, and get a lot of times people like to see 2 different scholars get together and answer questions together, and like see how they both approach these questions. And like, I feel like a lot gets done that way. I've had some epic moments, not just here, but I watch on Mythvision where he does this. He can get like Bart Ehrman and someone else together, and like it comes from a really good content, and hopefully we could do that going forward. But thank you for your time. And is there anything else you want to talk about or promote before we close this out?
Yeah, 2 things. I'm on the Twitter if anyone wants to seek me out there, and we have in North America what's called the North American Association for the Study of Christian Apocryphal Literature. I think that's what it is, NASCAL. So think NASCAR, but switch in the R. And we have a website and a Twitter presence as well. And the idea of the website is to make available to the public Apocrypha scholarship. So the NASCAL website has a huge bibliography of these texts. Somewhere like 250 or so of them, summaries and manuscript images and all that other stuff. So people are interested in that. So NASCAL's on Twitter. I'm on Twitter. So I have a blog too, but it's sorely neglected. So
is this not you?
Nope, that's not me. That's
I'm sorry.
It's TB Apoc, I think.
TB
APOC.
Oh, here it is. Here it is down here.
Oh, there you go. T. Burke Apoc. There I am.
There we go. I got you now.
There's some Australian minister or something who has my name.
So, guys, you saw what happened with there. I went to go find him, and I actually. So keep that in mind when you look him up on Twitter. It's not the first one that pops up. It's TB Burke at Apoc, or TB Burke Apoc.
Yeah. And on the right there, you see the NASCAL page as well. Twitter.
Oh yeah. There we go. Hit that one too.
Yeah.
And so you'll have the notifications when new events are coming up, like he was just mentioning. So, guys, I'm telling you, let's get connected on here, and let's learn and grow in our knowledge, in our gnosis. And that's what this is all about. So, as you said, there was one more, or was that?
Nope, that was it.
Okay. And thank you for your time. And like I always say, let me find my outro real quick. You have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.